Hello everyone, this is Clayton Witt here for discussion board number 4 for American Revolution, and this week we were tasked with actually showcasing what we were working on in regards to our research for the final project in this class. And so the items that I am actually looking at and the topic that I'm actually focusing on is more to do with the intellectual origins of the American Revolution and the founding of the United States. Particularly, I wanted to look at how the founders and Americans during the colonial period defined liberty. Because it's a word that comes up quite frequently in a lot of the writings of not just the Revolutionary period, but of the early colonial era as well. And you have a lot of founders and Americans using liberty and saying liberty as well. And I wanted to look in to see the definitions, at least from the time period, of what this meant. And part of the reason I chose this topic was because I think it's very important, particularly given our current time period. I think there are a lot of times when definitions of words and the way that words are used in previous generations are oftentimes overlooked for more modern connotations of the word. And if we're going to actually, have a country that is based on the concept of liberty, it should be based on the liberty that the founders intended it to be based on, rather than liberty that our current age how our current age defines it. And so that was kind of the prerogative of my project and of my research going in, and focusing specifically on the writings of not just the founders, but also of some ordinary Americans as well, looking at influences across the board from obviously regional influences, writings of, say, popular founders like John Adams and James Madison, but also looking at influences from across the water in Europe, particularly in England, some of the earlier writers and philosophers of the 17th century moving into the 18th century that the founders read and actually were took from their writings. So John Locke is a pretty big example of a philosopher that was very prevalent for the founders, particularly Thomas Jefferson. His treatises on civil government were very helpful in forming the thought process for the Declaration of Independence. And then, as well as some other writers and thinkers such as William Blackstone, who was very influential in law, as well as in John Milton, who John Adams specifically had a fascination with in some of his writings. As well. I also wanted to look at biblical influences and see particularly from where in the Bible the founders and other Americans looked for to define liberty, and kind of using those sources as ways to highlight their position and make their approach rational in that regard. And so I found a lot in terms of not just biblical passages, but also from sermons that were from the period as well, and references within those sermons, particularly allusions to biblical passages as well in those sermons as well. As well as some secondary sources that focus specifically on biblical allusions in Revolutionary era rhetoric. And just as a little sampling of kind of what I'm looking at here, one of my sources, secondary sources, is from a Michael Kamen in his book Spheres of Liberty, which is focusing particularly on this very same concept of trying to define liberty from the founders. And he says in the opening to his work, he says, defining and clarifying the true nature of civil liberty emerged as one of the most compelling challenges for leaders of the revolutionary generation. And so that's kind of highlights two things. One, it's going to be very difficult to try and track down a all-encompassing definition of liberty, but also that this was something that was very important to the founders themselves and to Americans themselves to understand what they believed and also understand the words in phrases that they were using. And so that helps me kind of focus the attention that I'm giving for this this subject. A couple of samplings of some of the primary sources, particularly we have John Adams in his Thoughts on Government, which was published in 1776. And John Adams says quite poignantly that fear is the foundation of most governments, but is so sordid and brutal a passion, and renders men in whose in whose breasts it predominates, so stupid and miserable that Americans will not be likely to approve of any political institution which is founded on it. And so that is focusing more on kind of what Adams specifically had his thoughts on liberty, and it assumes that a more free society, a more Republican society, if you will, is what John Adams is looking for. Not so much a monarchy, but a constitutional republic. He is kind of moving in that phrase, and that's kind of the focus for John Adams specifically. So he represents kind of more of the founder's view of it. Obviously, not everything that John Adams writes is going to be true for every single founder, but just as a highlighting of significant peoples that I'm looking at during this writing. And then finally, some of the influences from the previous century, the 17th century thinkers prior to the colonial period in the United States. And that is particularly from John Milton. John Milton was pretty significant in, at least specifically for John Adams, but also significant in England during the period of Oliver Cromwell during that time as well. And he wrote a treatise called The Tenure of Kings and Magistrates, which I have a copy of in this physical copy here. But he writes particularly that, for indeed, none can love freedom heartily but good men. The rest love not freedom but license, which never hath more scope or more indulgence than under tyrants. And so he ends up focusing on two dichotomies. There's liberty and there's freedom, but there's also license. And so this is kind of the thing that the founders themselves also have to balance, is that we can't just have everyone do whatever they want, because then that ends up falling into license, and that ends up having a tyranny in itself, kind of a tyranny of the majority, if you will, or a tyranny of, say, anarchy or something like that. But we have to look specifically at liberty, which is a more focused piece of freedom. It is freedom, but it has a bottom. It has a foundation. It is not something that just, well, you can do whatever you want. It has a foundation, and that is something that John Milton is focusing on here. And so that's kind of just a sampling of what I'm focusing on and what I'm looking at for my project, and I hope you enjoyed.